let's emphasize in this lecture a topic that questions a lot what you heard earlier in this course. Behavioral economics. What is behavioral economics? Behavioral economics is a field of economics that combines insights from psychology with economic theory to better understand human behavior, particularly when it deviates from the traditional economic assumption of rationality. In contrast to the neoclassical view that people make perfectly rational decisions based on full information and consistent preferences, behavioral economics studies how cognitive biases, emotions, and social factors influence decision making. It focuses on real-world behavior and seeks to explain why individuals often make choices that appear irrational from the perspective of standard economic models. What is the relation to institutional economics? Behavioral economics shares some roots with institutional economics in that both fields reject the idea of humans as purely rational, self-interested actors operating in a vacuum. Institutional economics emphasizes how social, legal, and institutional contexts shape economic behavior, arguing that human actions are influenced by habits, customs, and broader institutional frameworks. Similarly, behavioral economics recognizes the individual's decisions are influenced by social norms, framing, and institutional rules. For example, both fields argue that preferences are shaped by context rather than being fixed. Both critique the traditional Homo economicus model, which assumes individuals are rational and fully informed, as you also heard just momentarily, and bounded rationality, a concept that originated in institutional economics, notably through Herbert Simon, is also central to behavioral economics, highlighting that decision makers have cognitive limitations and face uncertainty. Thus, both fields aim to create more realistic models of human behavior by accounting for external influences and cognitive limitations. What are the key concepts in behavioral economics? Center to it, cognitive biases. What are cognitive biases? Cognitive biases are systematic patterns of deviation from rationality in judgment and decision making. People often rely on mental shortcuts or heuristics, which lead to predictable errors. Some common cognitive biases include, for example, the loss aversion. People tend to feel the pain of losses more acutely than the pleasure of gains, which can make them more risk averse. Anchoring. Individuals rely too heavily on the first piece of information they encounter, which is the so-called anchor, when making decisions, as well as the overconfidence bias. Individuals often overestimate their own knowledge or abilities, which can lead to risky decisions, as well as, for example, the status quo bias. People have a preference for the current state of affairs and tend to avoid change. Cognitive biases challenge the classical notion of rational agents, as we heard already, by showing that individuals often make suboptimal decisions to these mental shortcuts. Biases on a conceptual level are reflected, among others, in theories like the prospect theory. What is the prospect theory? Developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli scientists, in 1979, prospect theory describes how people make choices under uncertainty, particularly when faced with potential gains and losses. In contrast with expected utility theory, which assumes that the individuals make decisions by maximizing the expected utility of outcomes, the key ideas in prospect theory include the following. The loss aversion. As mentioned, people feel losses more strongly than equivalent gains, meaning the negative impact of losing $100 is greater than the positive impact of gaining $100. Reference points. People evaluate outcomes based on a reference point, often the status quo, which makes them more sensitive to changes relative to this reference point. Diminishing sensitivity. The value people place on outcomes diminishes as they move further away from the reference point. For example, the difference between $100 and $200 feels greater than the difference between $1,100 and $1,200, even though both involve a $100 change. Probability weighting. People tend to overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. This explains why they might overvalue lottery tickets, overweighting the small chance of winning, and undervalue highly likely events. Prospect theory helps to explain behaviors such as risk aversion in gains and risk seeking in losses, which cannot be fully understood using standard economic models. From the level of theory, we can move on to the representations and manifestations in the real world. This leads us to common narratives and public policy. Narrative economics, a concept popularized by Robert Shiller, is an extension of behavioral economics that looks at how stories, narratives, and cultural trends influence economic behavior. Humans are naturally drawn to compelling stories, and these narratives can shape economic decisions on a large scale. Here are some common narratives. This time is different. This narrative suggests that current market trends are fundamentally different from past trends and that traditional investing rules do not apply. In these times of market euphoria, market participants deny the past and might take excessive risks. Others are, the market is rigged. This narrative reflects that the financial markets are controlled by a small group of powerful insiders who manipulate prices to support their own interest, as well as the economy is in trouble. This narrative assumes that economic conditions are deteriorating and that financial markets are on the verge of meltdown. As well as the next big thing, this narrative suggests that the new technology or trend will revolutionize the financial markets and create huge investment opportunities. Behavioral economics has also influenced public policy, particularly through the concept of nudging, popularized by Richard Thaler, which involves designing policies that subtly guide individuals toward better choices without restricting freedom. This reflects the institutionalist view that policies should account for how institutions and social settings shape individual behavior. You're going to hear also about that in the next lecture. How are these concepts interconnected? Behavioral economics builds on the ideas from institutional economics by acknowledging the role of context, social norms, and institutions in shaping economic behavior. It introduces the concept of cognitive biases and challenges the notion of rational agents, using tools like prospect theory to explain decision-making under certainty. Additionally, it explores how common narratives can influence economic actions on a large scale, revealing the deep psychological and social layers behind economic choices. Together, these ideas provide a richer, more nuanced view of human behavior in economic contexts.